Well, I trust you've prayed that God will speak to us, and you've got your Bible open to Mark chapter 4, just that last paragraph there. If you haven't prayed, please pause now and pray, and then we'll jump in. We're at a point in this chapter where it's actually getting fairly serious to follow Jesus. So Jesus has made some big claims about himself. Every discussion we've had so far, he's kind of saying it's all about me. The Sabbath is all about me. And he's called his disciples to leave everything and follow him. And at this point in time, there's a bit of opposition coming from the scribes, from the religious leaders. So a devout person who wants to follow God is really in a bad spot here. Do they follow Jesus? And that means that the authorities are not going to be happy with them. But Jesus is asking for a big commitment. And so there would be plenty of people who are kind of going right at this point in time in Mark's Gospel, hey, wait a minute, is this worth it? Is it worth following this guy? Is he the real deal? Is he going to carry through on his promises? Is what he says true? And it actually might be something that you're asking as well. I don't know where you're up to in your journey of finding out about Jesus, about following Jesus, but it's a question you'll probably ask at some point or have asked. And it's a question you may ask now as it gets more and more difficult to follow Jesus in our world. And as we go through some difficult times here, where it's actually very difficult to be a Christian and do the normal things Christians have done for maybe all your life, is it worth following Jesus? Maybe a question you're asking. And the answer to that question is going to hinge on the answer to the question, who is Jesus? And that's the central question of this passage today of chapter 5, who is Jesus? That question is asked in the end of chapter 4. Let's have a look at that. Jesus, we find out, is the boss of nature. He's in a boat. They're going to the other side of the lake. Jesus is asleep. You may be familiar with this story. And then a storm comes up and water starts to get into the boat. The waves are so big they're breaking over the side of the boat. And the more water, the lower it goes and the more water comes in. So they're actually it's so bad that they're in danger of being drowned. They're afraid. The fishermen are afraid they've seen storms and they're afraid they're going to drown. So they wake Jesus up. Don't you care that we're going to drown, that we're going to die? And here's the amazing thing. It's incredible. Jesus says, silence, be still, the wind ceases, and there's a great calm. The waves stop. We read that from other Gospels. Now, I used the word incredible, and it actually is incredible. It's hard to believe that would happen. I grew up in Wollongong. The biggest waves come the day and the second day after the storm in the ocean, and a lake smaller, but it's the same thing. When the wind dies down, the waves still come. It takes a while for them to settle down. So this is not some natural occurrence where, the storm front passed over and that was it, because the waves died at the same time. There's something else going on here. Is it made up? Well, I don't think it would be made up because, I don't know, the disciples are the source of the information for our Gospels. They're the ones who passed on the stories. And do you see how bad they look in this story? Not trusting. Jesus tells them off. Verse 40 says, then he said to them, why are you fearful? Do you still have no faith? Don't you get who I am and what I'm here to do? You shouldn't be afraid. They look bad in this story. They wouldn't pass that on. They wouldn't make that up. If they're making up a story, they'd be the heroes, wouldn't they? And then we trusted Jesus and it all worked out okay. I told you so. It's not like that. This is authentic, but it's incredible. It's hard to believe. But what we learn from this is Jesus is the boss of nature. He calms a storm. He tells the lake, the waves, the wind what to do. There's 4 incidents here, and they're all about Jesus being in control. So he is someone with authority. Let's have a look at the next one. And you may be familiar with this because it's dramatic as well. There's a guy whose life is out of control. He's possessed by demons. He's inhabited by demons. And there's so many of them, they call themselves Legion. You maybe heard of the story. They go into some pigs. The pigs run down the hill and drown. But what we see is a life out of control. The guy was hurting himself. The guy was uncontrollable. They used to chain him up. They used to lock him up, and nothing worked. And Jesus says, come out of him. And the demons beg, and they do as they're told. And then it's just beautiful. It's beautiful. Look at verse 18. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed kept begging him to be with him. He's sitting there in his right mind. Verse 15, have a look at that one. They came to Jesus and saw the man who had been demon-possessed by the legion sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. They went, who is this guy? Who can do that? The storm, who is this guy who can do that? And again, this story is incredible, that someone could be so out of control and then just, it's fixed. But again, it's not just a mental illness thing, it's not something like that, because the guy's breaking iron chains. There's something beyond normal. The pigs doing what they do is not normal. There's something going on here. Jesus is the boss of demons, of the spiritual world. Then we get two incidents jumbled up. A crowd's gathered, and a synagogue leader, a fairly important person, comes to ask him for help. And he says, all right, I'll come with you. And he's going off to help the man with his daughter who's unwell. But as he's walking through the crowd, you can see there, verse 25, a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years, had endured much under many doctors. She spent everything she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. She'd paid the doctors till she had nothing left. There was nothing they could do for her. They couldn't help her. Again, we see, just like the last story, a situation where she's beyond help. No one can help her. And she just thinks, verse 28, if I can just touch his robes, I'll be made well. So she kind of creeps through the crowd, elbows closer, makes her way, and she just touches the back of his cloak. And she's healed. She knows the bleeding stopped. It feels different. Jesus knows that. He turns around and says, who touched my robes? And we see that Jesus is the master of illness, the boss of illness. He's in control of illness. Things that the doctors did not know how to fix, Jesus is able to heal. Almost unconsciously. He says to a daughter, your faith has made you well. And so we see Jesus is the boss of illness. And that's a great comfort to us at this time. Is it worth following Jesus? Well, we're following someone who is in control of nature, of the spiritual world, and of illness. But more than that. We go on and we see that after he leaves the woman, he continues on with the synagogue leader and goes to their house. And verse 35, when they get there, they say, your daughter's dead, don't bother the teacher anymore, there's no point. But Jesus said, don't be afraid, only believe. That's the theme of this chapter, isn't it? Don't be afraid. Why are you so afraid? Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, only believe. And they laugh at him. But he goes into the room, and then he took the child by the hand and said to her, little girl, get up. A child who's dead. And she gets up. She begins to walk, and he says, give her something to eat. We see Jesus is the boss of death. We see that again in Lazarus in John's Gospel, and next week we celebrate Easter, and we see that Jesus is the boss of death. That's great news for us, because in Jesus' resurrection, he opens the door and we can follow him, and we will be raised to life as well. So that's a great comfort for us, a great hope in this time where we've been reminded that life is uncertain, that times are uncertain, that we don't know where we're going, what's happening. We don't know how bad this coronavirus is going to get. But before the coronavirus, it was the same. Old people died of the flu. Old people died of infections. People with bad hearts, diabetes. We're just somehow more aware of it this year. But it's been happening. And so it's a great comfort that Jesus is the boss of death. So, is Jesus worth following? Well, that might be proof for you. These stories that just have all the details of true stories, of genuine stories. Boss of nature, boss of the spiritual world, boss of illness, boss of death. Jesus is in control. He's worth following. He is who he says he is. But there's a little bit more I just want to notice before we go any further. Is Jesus worth following? Just having power doesn't make someone worth following, but Jesus is worth following. Because what I want to notice is that Jesus doesn't just heal, doesn't just have power, but he also cares. Have a look at the way he talks to his disciples. He says, don't be afraid. And the theme of this, don't be afraid. And it's 3 times in here, don't be afraid. And I think God is a God of comfort. Jesus his power is with us for comfort, for hope, that we might not be panicked. A pandemic doesn't have to be a panic. Don't be afraid. Jesus wants us to trust him. And he's urging his disciples to see that because of who he is, we're going to be okay and we can trust in that. That's why I think religious services, funerals, weddings are essential at these times. More essential than ever, because we don't know who's going to die. And we can't stop. There's 20 people who've passed away on the ventilators with the full care. We haven't overloaded the hospitals yet, and people are still dying. Oh, so we need that hope, don't we? Because there's nothing we can do to keep our lives going and going and going. We need a hope for the future, a hope in the resurrection. But Jesus brings comfort. But I want to also notice that Jesus wants us to relate to him. There's that beautiful thing in that woman who snuck up behind him and touched his cloak, and she's healed. And there's lots of questions we could ask about like that. Why did that happen? Did Jesus know? Did he not know? Why did it work out like that? Is he just kind of radiating power like a, I don't know what. But what I want you to notice is that whole situation leads up to Jesus actually not wanting the woman to kind of somehow touch him and get zapped. But what he wants is for her to relate to him. Go back with me and look at verse 30. Once Jesus realized in himself that power had gone out from him, he knew someone had been healed, he turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my robes?" Look at the disciples. It's so cute how they answer. His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you and you say, 'Who touched me?'" They're like, "Everybody's touching you, mate." They're all bumping into each other. They were not doing their social distancing, all right? Everyone's bumping into you, Jesus. How can you say, "Who touched me"? There was 20 people who touched you just in the last 20 seconds. But he looks around because he doesn't want her to kind of sneak up and think God doesn't care, but I snuck a healing out of him. I tricked God into healing me. That's not what he wants her to think. He looks around and then I don't know whether he got eye contact with her, but she comes toward him. She can't hide it. She's got to admit it. Trembling, falling on her knees, she comes before him and says, "I touched you because I've been bleeding for these years and I just hoped that you could heal me." Listen to the beautiful care, the tenderness in Jesus' words. She's been bleeding a long time. She's older than him probably, but he says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be free from your affliction." Not just free from your affliction, but peace. I'm at peace with you. You didn't trick me. I'm not angry with you. God's not angry with you. God loves you. God cares for you. Go in peace. He wants her he wants to talk with her and comfort her and show God's love for her as he heals her, not just give the healing. Isn't it beautiful? And then he cares so much for the synagogue leader, and he says to him, don't be disheartened, only believe. Don't be afraid, only believe. He wants us to have hope. Jesus wants us to be walking with him, talking with him, relating to him. He wants us to have hope. He wants us to be comforted by him. And that's why I think it's worth following Jesus. Not just the power, boss of all those 4 things. He's the creator, so he's Lord of all things, but he's a loving, gentle, beautiful creator. I just want to answer one more question, because we read these things in the Bible, and I'm convinced they happen, but they don't happen in the same way today. And I've been thinking about the reason for that, and I think it's because of who Jesus was and what he came to do. Let me give you an illustration. You see, Jesus came for something more important, and you see that in the way he treated people today in this Bible reading. Who is Jesus and why did he come? Let me tell you, I don't know if you've seen it in the movies, you may have, but in the Second World War, the Nazi regime had conquered most of Europe, so they kind of steamrolled into France, and they had occupied France, and so Paris, the capital city of France, was being ruled by the Germans. When the Germans overreached themselves and started to lose, the Allies, Americans, English, a few Aussies, were coming through France and pushing the Germans back. The Russians were coming up the other way, so the Eastern Front. So Paris was being liberated in that way that war liberates people. The place is being destroyed. I don't know if you can see that picture back there, destroyed buildings, people with all that they own carried on their backs. So there's just refugees streaming out of Paris because it's being destroyed, because there's fighting, because there's no food, because the infrastructure's fallen apart. And I don't know if you've seen that image of the American soldier. It was a wonderful time for the American people, because in one sense it wasn't their fight. But they came in and they were freeing people from an oppressive regime, from a terribly wicked system, and setting them free from horrible things that had happened. And you see those pictures in the movies of the American soldiers stopping to talk to the refugees and give them something to eat and offer them some comfort. And then they get back on the road and keep marching. And this is what we need to realise, is that soldier, if he had actually stopped and actually given all his time to feeding those refugees on the outskirts of Paris, he would have actually betrayed his mission. And he would not have helped them in the long run. Because what the Allies needed to do was defeat the kingdom, defeat the army, and set the people free so that they could be the country they are now. Rebuild things and restart again without that oppressive military occupation. And that's what Jesus has come to do. You see, so what Jesus is doing is, as he's going to the cross that we remember at Easter, he's the kind of soldier, he's the kind of person on a mission that, because he cares about people, he'll stop and help them on the way. There's a man whose daughter has died, there's a woman who's been bleeding, there's a guy who's been oppressed by an evil spirit, and he'll stop and he cares about them and he loves them and his heart reaches out and he helps them. But he's not going to get sidetracked and end up only doing that, because he's going to the cross. And that's where he's going to deal with the biggest problem, is sin. The devil's kingdom that we are part of because of our sin. And as long as there is sin in the world, those terrible things will keep happening. Disease, illness, war, death. And Jesus fixes the big problem and sets us free. And now that Jesus has fixed that big problem, we're just waiting for him to come again and kind of wrap things up. I believe that's why we don't see these kind of things happening as much these days, because Jesus came, and as he was on that road, he was helping the people around him. But he's solved the problem now. And what we're doing now is just waiting for him to come again and telling people about what has already been achieved. The war's over. Time to rebuild. Time to get ready. That's where we are. Who is this man? Son of God, come to save us from our sin, but overflowing with love and grace and gentleness for everybody he meets on that road. Who is he to you? And have you found that gentleness, that mercy, that love?